That's a good question, and interestingly, how I wish the question had been reversed. Ask me why. How is the question had been asked in terms of even private citizens to declare, their assets? Because it appears to me that a number of these individuals who may have amassed wealth may quote unquote be people who are not public servants. But since the question was directed towards public servants, the law is very clear. When you look at Article 233 of the Constitution, it makes provisions for powers, Parliament to make powers, to make laws that would establish what they call the Leadership Code of Conduct. Meaning that every individual who is actually a servant, quote unquote, has to declare their assets at the same time. The intention of this is obviously to capture and arrest corruption as one of the measures that the government has put in place so that these public servants can be able to declare their assets. So that we can know, because many of us get shocked and get a lot of awe and wonder when we realize that some of these individuals who have actually spent some time in public offices end up acquiring wealth which is unaccounted for. And you and I know that most of this wealth is done at the expense of the public servant or the individual taxpayers' money. And so this goes to the root of the problem that Uganda has been facing for the last almost, ever since it declared itself as an independent state. So when I look at it as a provision of Parliament, yes, that's a good idea. And we have the Leadership Code Act. We have also got a whole body that is actually presided over by a director in terms of the IGG, the Ombudsman, who is supposed to carry on those day-to-day services of ensuring that individuals fall and oblige within the premise of, declaring their assets in terms of their income. Because you can see individuals time and again who are structurally provided for in terms of a salary, but then when you commensurate what they do in terms of those assets and wealth that they've acquired, you begin to wonder whether or not the salary they get is really quote-unquote commensurate with the money that is ordinarily given to them as their daily bread. So that's a fundamental question. And so the Leadership Code Act, which is Cap 168, has a number of provisions, including making people like the president, the vice president, the IGG themselves, the army officers, ministers, name them. They all are supposed to declare. They are actually all fall within the mandate of Cap 168 in terms of declaring their assets. So that becomes a question of importance for our country generally.
We are seeing a lot happening. We have many existing good legal framework in this country. But to what extent is this being adhered to? Since you have been a researcher for long, you have groomed many legal practitioners and the rest.
That's another interesting question. You see, the will to do or to root away corruption is perhaps one that should be the driving force in terms of ensuring that these individuals oblige with the requirement of the Leadership Code Act in terms of declaring assets and the likes. And this, as we will see, it is not only limited to the individuals themselves, but also to their families, to their spouses, to the children. There are regulations actually that provide for the assets of children and dependents in terms of them also filling forms and obliging the declaration of income of assets in terms of these children, because you and I probably know that some of these individuals may actually end up hiding some properties in the names of their children. So the law is very versatile on that end, because it also makes the provisions in terms of those individuals who ordinarily are dependent upon these particular individuals. Now, whether or not the law is hard enough to be able to address these particular issues is a question of debate, because when you look at the provisions of the punishments that are provided for, in terms of, for example, fines of 5 million shillings or 5 years imprisonment if you don't oblige, or perhaps if you lose your public servant job in the event that you don't oblige. The question is whether all of these punishments are punitive enough to stop the individuals from actually failing to declare or even declaring falsely. That's the question of debate. I am amazed that in spite of this law, you and I can point out a number of buildings in Kampala, for example, where we are arguably told that streets are owned by particular individuals who are actually within the premises of the government, who are actually retired, army officers, who are actually masquerade under the names of the entities of the president. We have blue-eyed boys in this country who actually act on and on behalf of particular individuals, and they're not even ashamed to declare that. These blue-eyed boys go around and, drive posh cars and give out monies and they air their things out with pomp. They work in particular individuals' offices without even knocking. These blue-eyed boys act on behalf of these individuals. So the question is whether the law is able enough to visit punishment on these particular individuals that we call blue-eyed boys. So these guys who actually are supposed to be, running within the premises of the Leadership Code Act have been able to beat the law by hiring these blue-eyed boys. So my quarrel with the law would be, how does the law be able to fish out and visit punishment on the individuals who are acting on behalf of these guys? We all know them. I mean, I can mention a few names here. We all know some of them who are not even unashamed. They even hold out rallies on behalf of these individuals. So to me, that's a lacuna that the law has to solve.
It's a lacuna that the law has to solve.
It does require amendments so that the law can be able to, there's what they call aiding and abetting. So my request would be so that the law can be premised on ideals that can also be able to capture people who aid and abet, these people who actually masquerade or who are blue-eyed people who act on behalf of these public servants, who are the movers and the shakers. At the end of the day, we all know, I can point at a building and say that building belongs to Minister so-and-so, or perhaps General so-and-so, but you won't see the general, but you know that this guy is acting on behalf of the general. Then we have a problem with our law. In England it's happened. We have what we call offshore laws that can be able to capture people who hide property in other jurisdictions where they know that the laws are actually winged. There's what they call evasion, avoidance, tax avoidance and tax evasion, which is now a question of debate. People have taken advantage of those lacunas and evaded and even avoided ordinarily taxes and even taken advantage of weaknesses of laws in other jurisdictions. So they end up offshore, using the offshore provisions, and they hide the law, hide their property in those jurisdictions because they know the arm is not long enough to visit them with liability. Even the goodwill of our fountain of honor. You remember one time that question was posed before them and said, listen, how about individuals who have actually, amassed wealth in this country and we're clearly aware that they're actually, stolen money? And he said, well, it's better because at least they've invested the money here. It would have been worse if they'd invested the money elsewhere. Already it tells you the flexibility of, the lack of resolute. If there was absolute resolute. I know recently the president had come out and said, wait a minute, we're going to visit liability or punishment on people who have actually taken the iron sheets away. And that's the only time I've had him saying, I've actually instructed the State House to go and, engage these particular people. But listen, even though the law is there, we still realize that the office of the IGG or the Ombudsman is weak enough and it can only face challenges that it's only permitted to do so. You remember one time when a whole IGG was supposed to go to a certain entity which was controlled by the military, if you remember, and these guys stood and restricted this IGG to enter that office. In fact, these individuals who refused the whole ombudsman of government were actually given honorary awards. Think about that. Citizenship honorary awards, the highest awards. I don't know whether we rewarded because they bent the law or because they're resisting. Those are questions that you and I ask, you know. So for you to say that I'm making a law, and then listen, even with that law in place and with that office in place, still there was a time even when His Excellency actually appointed a Lieutenant General, Lieutenant Colonel, I think, to have a special operation to deal with certain individuals. So we're now creating parallel institutions that ordinarily duplicity of functionality, which ordinarily would have actually been a premise of a particular entity, and all we needed to do is to support and make this body formidable so that people can oblige and feel the pinch when they break the law. I think the only time we remember is the likes of Chamuzi, the man where there was some kind of punishment that was where he lost actually his office because of failing to oblige with the fulfillment of what was required in the law as required under the Leadership Code Act. So the question calls for a lot of review. The question calls for a lot of goodwill. The question calls for a lot of whistleblowing, for example. You know, whistleblowing itself should actually be encouraged, where we see people, whistleblowers, who come out and act and speak, but they are not liable to be punished. You know, we should be embraced such entities so that they can be able to create an environment that is free of corruption. Because what we're talking about here is how do we, you know, root corruption out of our country because people are taking advantage of taxpayers' money. Kawegali kyangu nnyo okuba n'amateeka mu kitabo nti tugawandiise mu kitabo. Kyanjawulo nnyo okulaba nti amateeka gali mu kitabo gatuukirizibwa. Gwe nange tukimanyi tulina ofiisi ya IGG era omulimu gwayo palamenti yagutongoza neguwa n'etteeka nebaga empeeka negamba nti nkuwadde amaanyi okunoonyereza ku nsonga zino. Era omuntu yenna atakkirizibwa kukola ku nsonga oba amenya etteeka eryo tujja kubaako engeri gye tumupanishinga. Ekyo kyangu nnyo okwogera naye okwenforcinga bwe buzibu. Nkubuuza ne kugamba nti bw'obanga obazeebazeemu bantu batono nnyo 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 etteeka ligenze nga ligenda likuwonako. Era singa gwe nange tutuula wansi ne tumenyaamenya amannya ag'abantu be tumanyi nti bakozesezaako mu gavumenti, babadde ba ministers, babadde bakulira ebitongole, bameka ku bo b'omanyi etteeka lino lisobodde okumegulayo. Esenga okutuluma emitima nti tuzuula nti etteeka lirenga eryakolebwa abantu abakwatibwako naye ate terikolebwa eri abantu abo abatakwatibwako, kubanga sisitemu yaffe eringa eyabegebwa in such a way nti zino etteeka lyo likukwatako gwe ng'omuntu kubanga oli wa bulijjo, naye omuntu ali mu kibiina oba ekibinja ekyo ekyabakwatibwako ogenda okizuula nti etteeka bambi terisobola mukwatako. Era beeyagala ate abasinga balina ekikoosi kyabwe ekyo kye bayita mafia group ekibakolera emizannyo the data games, nti teweesaaga kulaba Lubogo ng'ali awo wabula alinayo abaana be emabega abazannya emizannyo gyabwe. Nze waliwo endagaano zimu ezibadde zindeeterwako olumokola oli nagamba nti gundi yagambye gwekola bukozi nti naye kino nga ndaba ng'ekizibu nti weteekako omukono gwe wandiika endagaano abasajja waliwo sisitemu jjo kitambuza. Ne mu politics by the way mulimu abantu abeeyagala nabagamba gwe tuweeraliikirira akalulu kano gwe newoba ogudde gwe kitulekere. Tulina babulu aidemeni baffe bajja genda bazannye omuzannyo batereeze omuzannyo era kibaddewo. So system nebanga nadde amateeka gano weegali mu biwandiike naye mu reality kyo bambi si we kiri. Era bwe nkubuuza nagambye nalwo IGG wegendako omuwungu certain place nga yina byanoonyereza abasirikale ne bamuziyiza naye ate mu kifo ky'okuba nti ffenna twala tugamba nti there is a problem there lwaki bamuganye ate instead bakwata abantu abo ne babawa emidaali nga babeebaza. So neweebuuza n'ogamba kiki? Ogamba ntaddewo institution erwanyisa okulya enguzi oba okulemesa ebyenguzi ne corruption mu ggwanga naye at the same time gwotaddewo institutions eziziriza okuba nti bano tebakwatako. So that is the biggest problem kyetuna mu ggwanga lyaffe nti kyangu nnyo okwogerako naye okuimplementinga kyanjawulo.
Oyogedde ku nnongoosereza zeetaaga okukolera mu tteeka.
okwogera ku kimu okulongoosa twetaaga okuba ntuteekawo amateeka agawagira omuntu wa bulijjo okuba nti alina n'information gy'asobola okuba nti asobola okuproviding eri IGG weewaawo ba Whistleblowers Act weziri naye remunerations and rewards okuba nti omuntu wa bulijjo asobola okugamba nti by the way akitegedde ekintu kyo kikwatagana ne kino ono yadeclarence naye kyeyadeclarence si kyekyo manyi nti etteeka lyogera ku baana n'abakyala naye ate mulimu ba relatives abalala ba blue eyed boys benkugambye abakola ebintu bino on behalf of other people naye nga tebakwatibwako ate nga bamanyiddwa abalala batambuza bivulu abalala bagaba amasente abalala bagaba n'amalooni so twetaaga etteeka nga libegeddwa okulaba nga lisobola okuvisitinga omuntu wa bulijjo akola on behalf of those entities kubanga ebyo kye bayita aiding and abetting be bantu be bagezaako ku aiding ate nga baddukiriza ebintu bino nga ffenna tubamanyi nedera n'ekirala abantu abamu bakweka obuyambi by'obugagga mu mawanga amalala offshores nga bamanyi obunafu bw'etteeka ne bategeera nti kangende mbikweka eri era nga yakimanyi nti kimu kasamba malako omulembe gwange mu holiday actually ne mu holiday nga bagenda manyi abatwalako ne ba house girl baabwe n'atwala family ne house girl ne bagenda okweyagalako mu offshores gye bakweka obugagga bwabwe katugo bulijjo omutunulira kuno naye ng'ate amazima the root of the problem ekyaliwo olw'okuba nti etteeka nnafu so that is the biggest challenge tulina mu mateeka gano